It's Monday vocabulary time. We're just doing short vocabulary today since we've obviously spent most of the class doing our cell presentations. So we've got two words today, stimulus and receptor. So our first word has two different endings depending on if it's singular or plural. So I went ahead and put them both in the word box. Stimulus is when it is something that is singular, when it's just one thing. But if you have more than one stimulus, it becomes a stimuli. So again, same definition, just a slightly different word depending on if it's singular or plural. So a stimulus is something. It's something that causes a response. So a stimulus is something that causes a response in a cell, a tissue, organ system, or organism. Oh, now everything we've learned is coming together. Yes. So a stimulus is something that causes a response, and it can be in a cell, a tissue, an organ system, or an organism. And you might notice this word response, and hopefully you remember that one of our characteristics of living things is that living things respond. And so now we know that they respond to something called a stimulus. So we're going to write in the details box that there are two types of stimulus. There's kind of two general categories. So you can have a stimulus that happens internal, right? So that means it could be inside the cell, inside the organ, inside of the organism. And as you can probably guess, the other option is to have an external stimulus, which would mean outside. So something like in the environment, right? Or just simply outside of the organ, like outside of the heart or outside of the leaf. So a stimulus is something, it could be anything that causes a cell, a tissue, an organ system, or an organism to respond. And again, it can be something inside the cell or inside the tissue, or it could be something external, something outside. So let's look at an example of something that's an internal stimulus. Oftentimes, an example of an internal stimulus would be a chemical signal, right? So inside of the cell or the tissue, there might be a chemical signal. An example would be something like a hormone, right? So it's a chemical message that's inside the cell or inside the tissue or inside the organism, right? And it might be something that the cell responds to. And then an example of an external stimulus, these are ones we're probably more familiar with. So something could be temperature, right? So the temperature could be an external stimulus, right? If it's very cold, maybe the organ known as your skin, it might cause goosebumps to develop. Another good example, let me just give you another good external stimulus, is sometimes there is an external stimulus like sound, right? Like a loud noise might be something might react to, or another one could be pressure. So a stimulus is just something that causes a response. So in order to get information about a stimulus, you're going to need to have something called a receptor. So our second and our last word today is the word receptor, and it goes hand in hand with stimulus. So a receptor is just a structure. A receptor is a structure that receives stimuli, right? So it gets stimuli. A receptor is a structure that receives stimuli and sends information about the stimuli. So a structure that receives stimuli and sends information about the stimuli. And the key detail here is you can imagine there's all kinds of stimuli out there in the world. So that means that receptors are going to be specialized for each kind of stimuli that's out there in the world or inside of the organism. So I'm going to write here that receptors are specialized. There's that word again, specialized. We saw that when we were talking about cells joining together to form tissues. Receptors are specialized for each stimulus. So receptors are specialized for each stimulus. And you'll quickly kind of understand that as I show you some examples here. And again, many of these are receptors that you know by other names. So many organisms have a receptor called an eye. And an eye is a receptor for light. Right? So your eye is sensitive to light, and that is a receptor that picks up light, and then it sends to your brain information about that light. Another structure I'm thinking of that I'm thinking of particularly in snakes, but this also applies to humans. Many organisms have a structure called a tongue, and especially in things like snakes, that tongue is giving them information about taste, and also in the case of many snakes, about smell. So the tongue is a receptor, right? It picks up information about taste or smell, and then it sends that information on to the rest of the organism. My other example here, and again, this is going to be more of a plant and more of an animal example than a human example, but many organisms have hair structures. Again, not like the type of hairs that we have on our head, but hairs that are sensitive to touch or to movement. So for example, there are many types of plants who when, you brush up against them, they might have little hair structures on their leaves, and then their leaves might kind of curl up. This is also something we find on like a Venus flytrap. We also find this with organisms like, think of a cat, right? A cat has whiskers on it, and it uses those hairs or those whiskers to provide it information about touch or movement. So again, these are just a couple of examples of types of receptors that organisms might have so they can get information about stimuli and send information about the stimuli to other parts of the organism. So in the next week or so, we're going to be looking at examples of stimulus and how those stimuli are picked up by organisms through structures that are called receptors. I'll leave this up here a few more moments, and that's it for our vocab today.